All right, Pete, I'm super excited to start with one of the most intense passages in the Bible today. It's from Revelation 21:8, and it says this: "But as for the cowardly, the faithless, the polluted, the murderers, the fornicators, the sorcerers, the idolaters, and all liars, their place will be in the lake that burns with fire and sulfur, which is the second death."
Yeah, that's in the Bible?
This is in the Bible.
Okay, yeah. Well, okay. I mean, the thing is, we want to talk about these clobber passages, right? And not to sort of like make them all safe and cuddly, because there's plenty in the Bible that's just weird and difficult. This is one of them, and it's toward the end of a difficult book, the book of Revelation. That's part of the issue here, that you've got this weird book that is easy to misuse and misunderstand. But I mean, let's face it, we do have here like two kinds of people, and there's the good place and the bad place, and what does that mean? So, I mean, one way of looking at it is, I think, really this goes with anything in the book of Revelation. Take a step back and try to understand the big point of the book.
Yeah.
And it really seems to be, I mean, this is, most scholars are in this place where it's really describing something of historical importance in the first century. So it's about the persecution of Christians at the hands of the Romans. And this whole book is sort of a revelation, hence the book of Revelation. It's parting the curtains to seeing behind the scenes. It looks bad. It looks really bad because you have this, impossible to defeat Roman economic war machine, and it's very tempting to align with them. And then you have this Christian calling, so no, peer back the curtain, look behind at what's really happening, and you see the one who's really running the show isn't an economic war machine, but it's a lamb. In fact, it's a slain Lamb of God who's, there's praises happening around the throne. So it's really, that's what's being set up here. It's like, who will you choose? And don't be fooled by Rome. Don't worship Caesar. Don't worship Rome, which is a very tempting thing to do. And so you have, two kinds of people when it mentions like polluters or fornicators or this or that. It's really describing not just like sins in general that are like icky. It's more describing the people who have unfortunately decided to be seduced, so to speak, by this thing that's anti-God and anti-Christ, which is this, let's call it, political regime. Right? And if you really want to apply this to like today, it's not who's going to heaven, who's going to hell. It's more, are you aligning with any political regime rather than aligning with the Lamb who looks like he's not in charge because he's a slain lamb, but he is anyway. Yeah. And that can go in America, with any political party. If you put your hope in that, right, you're actually making the mistake that the book of Revelation is telling you not to make.
I love that. And that's a great cultural and historical background. And then can you talk a little bit about what genre of book Revelation is? Because I think that's helpful with this too. Yeah,
there is a genre that's called apocalyptic, which means like an unveiling or revealing, hence book of Revelation, right? And it's not about, I mean, when we think of apocalyptic, we think of like video games where the world's blowing up and stuff like that. But apocalyptic means here's what it looks like, but something is being revealed about a deeper reality. Right, so you have, again, Rome looks like it's in charge, but it's really not. And so that is being revealed. This is the true state of the matter. And what's happening is that the power of God is going to keep breaking into culture. That's how the book ends. It ends with not so much, here's what's going to happen thousands of years from now, but this is what's coming. What's coming is the reign of God on earth. Yeah. And you have a choice to make which side you're going to be on. Apocalyptic literature expresses this big seed change that's going to happen in very weird imagery. Imagery of animals, beasts, this, multi-headed whatever, locusts all over the place. And that is part of a way of talking that was very well understood in the ancient world. We actually have apocalyptic literature in the book of Isaiah, we have it in Ezekiel, we have it in Zechariah, we have it in Daniel, which is the big one. And it's a way of talking about what God is up to using highly symbolic language. I think the difficulty, this really gets us back to the passage, the difficulty is going to the book of Revelation and trying to find sort of a literalness to it and saying, well, this is literally true. It's true, but it's symbolically true, right? So, I think that's where the imagery of like the lake of fire comes in, and eternal life, or the second death and things like that. I think
sulfur and
sulfur, right? And those were images in the first century. Those were Jewish images, which actually go back to images of the Old Testament, like Gehenna, which is a big topic to get into. But it's all these things were known, and that's why I think studying this book is really important, and not just seeing verses and saying, I'm going to clobber people with this. But this is a difficult book to understand. People have been struggling with the book of Revelation since forever. It almost didn't make it into the Bible.
Yeah.
There was a negotiation between the Eastern and Western church saying, I'll give you Hebrews if you give us Revelation. And Revelation's there. It's actually a beautiful book if you don't read it as predicting what's happening in the newspaper today, which is how a lot of people were raised. I had that in my background too. So when we read it as saying something of importance that's happening in a very specific historical moment, but can be applied in different ways at different times, because there's always an antichrist, right? It's not just one person who's going to be born, in 1947 or something, the way I was taught when I was younger, but it's like anytime something shows up. America can be the Antichrist. America can be the beast if it's alluring you away from fidelity to God and replacing that with something else, right? And you could say, and I will say, that that passage could be applied to people who confuse commitment to Christ with commitment to any sort of political regime. And again, I'm not picking on a particular party, because this can happen all over the place with any form of government. You always have to be careful of what people call civil religion. It's making the political system basically your God and baptizing it with a little bit of religion. So you sort of mix those two things together. The message of the book of Revelation is you keep those things separate and you keep your focus on the real reality, not the little reality that we're playing around with here.
So good. Yeah, I love that. The idea of this is actually speaking to the politicization of Christianity.
Right.
And that can be across time, but what you're saying is that this was anchored in a point in history. So this isn't necessarily, the locusts don't represent American war flying
helicopters.
War flying creatures, which is helicopters. Yes, exactly, like the helicopters and all of that stuff. So what would you say to people who maybe have grown up thinking of Revelation as this literal thing that's happening in the future and taking these images that would have made sense to them, and we are trying to apply it to our context today in ways that aren't helpful? Like, what would you say to people?
First of all, I understand why people would do that.
Yeah.
If you're taught that respecting the Bible means reading it literally, that's going to happen. I just think it results in a misreading of the book of Revelation. So I would encourage people not to read it literally, but to read it literarily. Right? That's a weird sort of maybe distinction to make, but it's sort of like, I want to read Jesus' parables literally, which means I don't think there's actually a sower going out to sow. It's a story, right? There isn't really this treasure under a rock, right? So, but reading it in the way it's intended to be understood. And the way the book of Revelation is intended to be understood is not literally, it's symbolically. The question is, what does this symbolism mean? And for any book of the Bible, but especially for Revelation, it's about really digging in and doing some homework. And that can mean simply getting a couple of good study Bibles and reading the notes, or reading the opening 2 or 3 pages explaining, here's the genre, here's where it's coming from, people would have understood this or that, and having really good explanations in terms of what's happening here. Because it is a difficult book to understand. And if we go for sort of a literalistic kind of way of reading it, it gets really messy and it gets very dicey. And I mean, think about this. If Revelation 21:8, taking that literally, it's like there's no chance for forgiveness for people, you know, for idolaters and this or that. It's like, but you see, this is another aspect of Revelation is this thing that scholars call the rhetoric of warning. You know, there's an urgency about the spread of the gospel, let's say, and there are basically two types of people. There's no gray, right? Other parts of the Bible, there's tons of gray. Yeah. In Book of Revelation, there isn't. So to take the Book of Revelation and say, this is something now that is for taking literally, that's literally valid, regardless of time, regardless of circumstances, I think is really a misreading of the text. Yeah. And you have to balance that with other parts of the Bible that don't talk like that.
Yeah, I love that. That's so helpful. It reminds me of like the tortoise and the hare, where it's like, if you hear that, it's like, yeah, the point of that is like slow and steady wins the race, like in our lives and stuff, but it's to be faithful to that story wouldn't necessarily be talking about like what kind of tortoise was this and what kind of hare and what forest were they in.
Right.
It's like actually we miss the forest for the trees sometimes.
And there is a moral to the story. There is a forest here that is actually very beautiful, which is have confidence. As hard as it is, despite appearances, don't get sucked into this because that is not real. That's not ultimate reality. And how dare you take ultimate reality and pair it with that? And it doesn't matter what the that is. Yeah. See, it's not which American party we're talking about. It's both. It's all, right? It's England. It's a name. Name your king from the beginning of recorded time to whenever. Everyone's always making the same mistake. And the book of Revelation is saying, basically, not on my watch. We're not going to do this. This is not the way it's done.
I love that. Yeah, this is so helpful. Thanks for talking about it.
Sure.